Hi, John. Just a small add-on from yesterday that I forgot about was just one of the problems I had when I was operating on Fire Force out of Darwin before the KCARs was we were with the RLI and we went into um, a contact punch-up and I started firing the MAG and after about 50 rounds I had a problem. The gun stopped. So I recocked and fired again, fired 4 rounds, and the gun again stopped. So I then had a look at my ammunition belt because the gun was fed from an ammunition box on the left-hand side on the step that held 1,000 rounds. And I had a look down, and somebody had removed every tracer round after the first 50. So I had all the rest of these belts that had no tracer in. So there I was sitting on the back seat while we're flying around trying to fill up all these empty slots with ball rounds. And it's one of those things that no one ever knew or found out why, how, or who. And we had another one when the KCAR arrived and we were at that Centenary. Somebody actually pinched a 20 HE round, and he wanted it for a souvenir, basically. Now, for the fuse on the end of the HE round, there are two small ball bearings in there that hold the fuse cap in position. And when the round gets fired, the inertia and the spinning motion from the rifling and the barrel separates these two ball bearings, and the and plunger comes forward. And as soon as that strikes anything, whether it be a leaf or a blade of grass, it'll go off. And I had the experience of being in a punch up in the KCAR, and we fired at a target on the ground. It was raining very heavily, and the rounds actually went off about 8 meters away from the door of the gunship. And as we fired them, they were hitting the raindrops and going off. It was a bit of a frightening sight just to see all these explosions as you're going along. But this bloke actually pinched one of these rounds, and he had it in his shed in Salisbury, and he was trying to disarm the fuse by using a drill, and he actually drilled into the det, and this thing blew up, and it sorted him out. So it's just one of those things that it's meant to kill, and that's what it does, And one of the other experiments we had, one of the problems we had when we first got the KCAR was the scarcity of the ammunition, because it was either made in France or in Spain, and it was very hard to get hold of. And we were told to minimize, and they actually tried an experiment where they used 2 ball rounds, one HE round in the belt, and it wasn't doing any good, basically. And at one stage, they were trying all ball rounds. Even though it was very accurate, you might as well hit a guy with an MAG round. And then they also tried 2 twin Browning 5.0s, half-inch Brownings in the cradle, and pulled out the 20 mil, and they put these 2 half-inch Brownings in. And Ginger Morris was running that experiment, and I tried firing it, and it's very hard to hold stable because you could never synchronize the 2 guns. And there was always one firing ahead of the other, and they'd actually pull from side to side. So it was never accurate.
Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome back Peter McCabe for another session. Peter had a lengthy career as a flight sergeant in the Rhodesian Air Force, and we look forward to having more of his recollections. Over to you, Peter.
Hey, John, good morning to you. Yeah, I'd like to just sort of go on from where I left the last one. In the your Brown jobs, you had your regimental sergeant major who looked after you lot and your discipline, what have you. In the Air Force, we had the SWAMAN, who's the station warrant officer. Right. And at New Serum, initially our station warrant officer was Pat Gatton, and he's a leftover from the RAF days, and he used to bicycle everywhere. And he had a regulation bicycle, lever brakes, and bicycle clips, the whole issue, And he didn't like 7th Squadron blokes. Because we made his tidy airfield look awfully untidy, because we'd come in from the bush, aircraft change, you'd be in shorts and fellies and a t-shirt, and it wasn't befitting of his station, and you'd be away for long periods, and you'd come back with long hair, and one of his favorite things was to walk up behind you and say, "Sergeant, am I hurting you?" And you'd say, "No, sir, Mr. Gatton. Why?" He said, "Well, I should be, because I'm standing on your bloody hair. Get a haircut." It's either that or he'd say, "Sergeant, I'm very sad today." And you say, "Gee, Mr. Gatton, why are you sad today?" He said, "Because I can't see my reflection in your bloody shoes. Shine your shoes." So it, uh, it was a love-hate relationship, actually. But so it's one of the things we had at New Serum was the pie boy, and it was run by the canteen, and he had a tricycle, a delivery bicycle, like the old bread boys used to have. And he used to wind his way from the canteen on around about lunchtime, and he'd go via the guard room up into the security area, around parachute training, air dispatch, and eventually wound up at 7th Squadron. And by the time he got there, he'd sold almost everything, and he would not change his route. He sold everything. So we haven't decided that one day we've had enough of this, and we hopped on. We hooked our little 4-wheel trailer behind our Massey Ferguson 65 tractor, and we all went zooming out of the security area, because we had one of our lads down at the squash courts with an A60 radio, and he let us know when he appeared from the canteen. So we all went down there, and we hijacked this guy. We bought all his good stuff. We actually paid for it, and we put it in our trailer, and we rushed back to 7th Squadron. And boy, did that cause mayhem, because everywhere he went, he said he was sold out. And when he wound up at headquarters, the CO was there and the swowman, and they wanted their pies, and hence there were no pies. And he sort of explained what happened. So immediately, Mr. Gatton and the commanding officer came down to 7th Squadron and wanting to know what's going on. And we sort of explained, he always gets here empty, and he won't change his route. So they were not impressed. And Pat Gatton went in to see our squad leader, Eddie Wilkie, and to make a formal complaint. In the meantime, we're having great fun, and we're selling pies out the side window of the squadron or whatever. But while he was in there, I don't know how it happened, but his bicycle got dismantled and laid all over the hangar floor. And he was not impressed by that. And it's just one of the next times one of our guys committed a misdemeanor. Same issue. He'd ride up on his bicycle, take off his bicycle clips, straighten himself up, go in and see the CO. And this time he tried to leave, and his bicycle was welded to the hangar wall. So he was not a happy chap. But yeah, it was just one of the joys. I think we got away very easily compared to your RSMs, because it's when I did my medics course at Bulawayo. Even though I was a flight sergeant, it didn't help, because it's just you had to wear medals and everything, and I just went down there with no rank, no nothing, so I wasn't impressed. And then the interviews you've had before, you've heard of Spike Owens. He was warrant officer on 4th Squadron, affectionately known as Wobbetok. Warrant Officer 1 Bill Owens, thieving old chap, or any other sort of word you'd like to use there. But we were operating out of Mugwe in Mozambique. We had Trojans there and LOs. One of the Muscle brothers, either Brother Frank or Brother John, was OC. Dave Abrams was our cook, and as we were operating with the SAS and the RAR, and this is one of the joys of working down there, was that the Portuguese, they gave us free fuel and free beer for fighting their war for them. So you had they gave you a supply of little brown bottles of Laurentino or 2M beer, which was basically free. And old Spike Owens was there, and you'd be working on your aircraft or underneath your aircraft, and you'd put your spanners down, and you'd feel around for your spanners. You had to do up something, and they'd be gone, and there'd be Spike Owens walking away with a piece of rag shining up your spanners and putting them in his pocket. And his excuse was he found them lying on the ground, which he did basically. So, but he had to leave to do a crew change. So he loaded his Trojan, him and his pilot. They put so much beer in the Trojan that he had no room for his toolbox, because his toolbox was heavy, and he locked it and he put an address on it, and he said, when the DC-3 comes through for resupply, send this back to Thornhill to us. So this Trojan had so much beer in it. The only reason it got airborne was due to the curvature of the earth, because it was full, and so as soon as it disappeared over the horizon, so we got hold of his toolbox there, and it wasn't much of a lock, so it was immediately picked, and everybody claimed their spanners and emptied out all the rest, and they were sent to various other places, and we filled his toolbox with rocks, and we put the lock back on it, and we sent it back to Thornhill. He was not one happy bunny, I can tell you that much. But one of the only, well, a few of the good things that did come out of Spike Owens was his in any shed he had everything, and when Jack Mullock was building his Mark 22 Spitfire or refurbishing it, it's amazing what came out of Spike's shed. There were Mark 22 Spitfire service manuals, maintenance manuals, special Rolls-Royce Griffin tools, and all these things. I think they were handed over under duress, but it helped old Jack out quite a lot. And at one stage on 4th Squadron, when Spike was there, he had Henry Jarvie and Phil Tubbs, who I've mentioned before, the naughtiest buggers in the Air Force. And this is one day they really got up to mischief. And Spike told them in no uncertain terms to get out of his sight. That was his exact orders: get out of my sight. So away they went, and about 4 days later, the hotel manager at Bala Bala Hotel phoned up the Air Force and asked them to please come and fetch these two reprobates because he was running out of stock. And old Jarvie and Tubbs had rolled up there, and they were obeying his orders, so they couldn't even do anything to them because he told them to get out of his sight, and there they were at Bala Bala enjoying themselves. Great stuff, yeah. And so while we were on Thornhill and 4th Squadron, I think one of the techs you interviewed that I forget his name, but he mentioned about Bob Breakwell, who got burnt in the when the Frantan went off under the Trojan wing. It turns out that there were two other guys who were also armorers who were helping him, Steve Stead and Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was 20 course, my course. Both were sergeants at the time, and Steve was holding the front, and Flamer was holding the back, and Bob was right in the middle, and he was decrutching the hang up, and it went off while they were both there. So they all three of them got burnt, but Ian Fleming affectionately afterwards was known as Flamer because he got burnt, and Steve Stead, and they both served on 7th Squadron. Both earned themselves an MFC, and unfortunately, Ian Fleming was killed on the same day that Henry Jarvie was. It was a very sad day. So that was just to finish off that about the Frantan incident, and then in my first interview, I mentioned that I was flying with Dave Thorne in Mozambique when the two Trojans got taken out by the Strela, the surface-to-air missiles. And the outshoot of that was now that we knew that these guys had surface-to-air missiles and all our aircraft were vulnerable. The South Africans had been working on a Strela shroud, they called it, for the Alouette 3s because they'd had the same problems in Southwest and Angola. And overnight, a C-130 arrived, and there were these kits for all the Alouette 3s, South African or Rhodesian, and they were fitted overnight. And they were big, ugly things, but they worked. And eventually, the ASS guys, Peter Rawlings included, they made a lightweight version of it, which was much better. But the Trojans and the Provosts and the DAX, anything with a piston engine, basically had to have the exhaust shielded. So it was, I've given you photographs there of all the aircraft that were modified. And the exhaust was basically turned to face upwards, and a glass fiber shroud was put around it so that induced air from the airflow in and mixed with the exhaust gases to cool it off. And they did this for, as I say, all the piston engine aircraft, including the old DAC. You can see they had these big round exhausts over the exhaust, and it all the way up to the trailing edge of the main plane. It really looked ugly, but it worked. And then after we had the incident with the two Viscounts, they put the shrouds on the Viscounts as well, and it really looked ugly because you had these dull grey Viscounts with these great big exhaust pipes hanging out the bottom of them. But it worked as well, you know. So that was the on-shoot of that. And then when I was first on 7th Squadron, 73, sorry, we used to take 5 troops, 5 RLI, 5 SAS, or 5 RAR, and 5 RAR troops is a lot of troops. And the first model aircraft we had were the Alouette 317s, and the problem you had was the engine was rated at 750 horsepower, and it was actually derated, but the gearbox was basically set at 500 horsepower, and the actual gears used to wear out because we were overloading these things. And in the oil train in the gearbox, there was a small magnet on the end of the filler plug, and all the oil that was going towards the filter and the pump went past this magnet, and it was part of your inspection where you had to check how much metal was actually on this magnet, which was showing you how fast your gearbox was breaking up. And if the actual fur on the magnet exceeded the diameter of a 10 mil ring spanner, you had to change your gearbox. There just wasn't a question about it. And then we explained all this to the French, and the later model, Alouette 3, was known as the 319 model. It had an extra planetary gear in the gearbox, so they retrofitted this 319 gear train into our early aircraft, and that solved the problem, plus the fact we went down to 4 troops. And the other difference of the 319 aircraft was that all the switches and circuit breakers were now in the roof. Before the switch panel was on the console, where all the flying instruments were, and now it was up in the roof. So the pilot had all these switches up in the roof and the circuit breakers, and you had a big loom that went from this fuse panel, switch panel, down the inside of the mainframe of the actual the cockpit itself, on the tubular members that held the perspex. And you had this big loom that sort of went down in front of the pilot and then into the into the console. And I was operating out of I think Mount Darwin with John Britton was there, and the Fire Force at Grand Reef. They were down in the either the Hondi Valley, the Burma Valley, I forget, but they were having a big punch up, and they just wanted help, so they decided to send 2 aircraft from Mount Darwin with troops and to help them out. So John Britton, myself, we thundered off with our pilots and 4 troopies each, and we arrived there, offloaded our troops, and we had to immediately go and refuel, and we were told where the refueling point was. So we rolled up at the refueling point there, and there was an Alouette there on the ground with the rotors stopped, but the motor was still going. And it was Mike Borlace, and his tech was Henry Jarvie, and he'd taken a round straight through this loom, and it had actually cut the loom in half. So he had no electrical power, no radio, no nothing. And the Artusta 3B, once you started burning and turning, it had its own fuel pump, and it was it would keep running as long as it had fuel. It would keep running, so he kept that running, but he had no radio, no nothing. And one of the things that you'd bear testament to is the A60 and the A63 and the A76 radios that you guys used. Those poor radios used to take rounds all the time, and all their handsets you get dragged off, whatever. And I managed to get hold of a handset plug, and I modified it to take the socket for a headset, and I put a little press talk button on it, because the idea was if we had radio failure, you could use an A63 or an A76 to get you out of trouble. The pilot could use that as a radio. So I showed this to Mike Borlace, and he was all agog. He said, right, he went and found a radio, and Henry Jarvie hopped in my aircraft, and I started to repair his aircraft, which was in the front. So I pulled off, and I had a 24-volt soldering iron, and I started soldering his wires together. And with the Alouette 3, all your flight instruments are wind-driven. You've actually got a venturi on the on the combustion chamber that draws air through it, and that air goes through the instruments and runs up the gyros on the heading and your artificial rise and etc. and your airspeed indicator. So he was quite happy to fly. He had this A63 radio in his lap, and there I was in the front of his aircraft, head down, arse up, no bone dome on, nothing, and I was soldering while he was flying. And we spent the next hour just flying around, and he was moving troops. He had another aircraft to help him land and what have you. But I finally soldered all these wires together, and I was very fortunate when that was finished. I could actually get back in the gunner's seat, and it was a much better position to be in, because you didn't know what the hell was happening. And one of the things I was thankful for, that Mike didn't have his old English sheepdog, old Doris, he didn't have him on that op because that was Doris's spot, was in the front there. And it would have been a hell of a fight to put the two of us in and try to do some work. It was all very interesting. And just later on in that same era when Henry Jarvie and Mike Borles were in the K car, Henry Jarvie actually took a round right through his gun sight, and it's basically exploded in his face. But he went on firing, irrespective. It was that was later on that same day. With the modification of the gearboxes for the Alouettes, you had to confirm the weight of each aircraft so they could actually work out how much power the pilot could pull. So it was an emergency briefing that all aircraft had to be returned to New Serum and be weighed. Now, to weigh an Alouette 3, there are 3 jacks, because there are 3 jacking points underneath, and the aircraft had to be leveled out. All the pins had to be put in the control, so all the controls were in exactly the same place. The main rotor blade was over the back with a plumb bob, and the blades were all locked with pins, so everything was in the same position. And the way the aircraft, so all these aircraft had to fly back to Serum, and all the pins were in, and the crew would help them. They'd weigh them, and then they'd work out the calculation, and they knew what their weight was. And it was quite a festive type season with all the aircraft were back, and everybody was who you didn't see in for months at a time. We were all having a chinwag outside the hangar, and old Graham Cronshaw and Dan Archer were winding up to go back to wherever they were. And I saw a flash of red on the head, and I just started running because I knew that they'd left the 3 drag link pins in the top of the head, and they hadn't seen them. And he was winding up to go, and it's without the blades being able to move backwards and forwards. As soon as he started moving, it would have caused a hell of a lot of complications. So I ran up to him and gave him the old stop, 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 and cut, cut, cut. And him being a flight lieutenant, he did not want to listen to this mere sergeant saying, stop, we want you to stop, So I reached in behind him, and I closed his fuel cock. And an Alouette 3, when it's winding up and the rotors are going, makes a lot of noise. And when you suddenly stop the motor, it goes awfully quiet. And then an awful lot of people came running out of the hangar and head out of the offices. They wanted to know what was happening. And Graham Cronshaw was just about ready to tear me out a new arsehole there because I'd interfered with his aircraft. And as he hopped out and was unbuttoning his helmet and whatever, he's just about to shout at me. And I just pointed to the head, and there you could see these 3 red flags from the pins just dangling. And both him and Dan had missed it on their pre-flight. And well, we had another running with Graham Cronshaw. We were operating out of Darwin with the RLI, and Colonel Parker decided that he would be the KK commander. And it wasn't a lemon, but there wasn't much going on, so we decided to land on one of those big rocks outside of Darwin. I forget their names, but the fire force landed up there, and the troopies went on with their searches and what have you, and we could see them. We had contact with them, and we bring up some the techs were bringing up some tea in one of the choppers there, and Colonel Parker, a lovely man, he came over and he catched a cup of tea off us, and old Graham Cronshaw came over because, as I mentioned before, the state of the dress of the techs coming back to New Serum in shorts and fellies and what have you, the swimman had sent out a directive that all members had to wear socks with their shoes and shorts and what have you. So this was an early morning wake up sort of first light, and the siren went, so everybody dashes out, and it's your 4 S's, shoes, shirts, short, and shooting on, and away you went. You didn't worry about anything else. And Graham Cronshaw walks up to us, and he said, "You guys have read about the directive." He says, "I'll deal with you when we get back to Darwin about this no sock stuff." So I said, "Oh shit!" And then Colonel Parker, he lifts up the trouser legs of his camouflage. He didn't have socks on. He said, "Well, boys, I reckon we're all in the shit. What do you reckon?" So fortunately, nothing happened. It was all very interesting. And yeah, that on the
Sorry, Peter, if I could interrupt you there. Do you have any stories about Colonel Parker's tragic death when
no, I heard that he they hit this illegal wire that was across the river. But I was in Darwin when it happened, and I just heard about it. It's a very, very sad day because because he was a real gentleman, Colonel Parker.
Yeah.
And no, it was a very sad day. The pilot was the only one who made it out. I think he lost a leg, but all the rest were taken out, which was very sad. Yeah, it was down in the Sabia, I think, somewhere down there. And no, it was, as I say, a very sad day. There's many sad days, but that was a very sad day. Yeah, then Dave Thorne and myself, we were called out from New Serum to go to Victoria Falls, and there was an incursion up there, so we had one ep153, and we called through Wanky to refuel on the way through, because the flight from New Serum, you had to land in Gwakwi, which is in the middle of nowhere. You'd refuel and you'd fill up, and that would take you to Wanky, to FAF1, and the OC at FAF1 at the time, I think it was Gordon Wright. He had his own links there. He could he used it operationally, and it saved them having to position a pilot up there when he was a pilot. So if anything happened, he would hop in and away he'd go. So we were there refueling, and he was heading up to Vic Falls. And as he pulled out of his revetment, I once again saw red, and I just sort of dashed in front of him and stopped him, because him and his tech had left the rear engine intake cover on. And it's a big red thing, and it allows air into the rear engine. It's a big scoop, basically. And once again, he wasn't very impressed that I went out and stopped him. But it's one of those pointing up and you see this red stuff, you know.
Yeah.
But an amusing incident when Dave Thorne and myself were at the Vic Falls, we stayed at the police camp, and our landing pad was the actual foundation or floor slab of a building that had been demolished, and it made a very handy sort of nice landing pad, no dust. And we were waiting one day, and we had a whole bunch of RAR troops up there waiting to deploy. And I said to Dave, let's have some fun with these guys. So I went up to the stick leader and explained to him that our battery was flat and we needed a push start. So I had all these guys and showed them where to push. And they all, and I said, when I say push, I want you to push. And old Dave Thorne is in the cockpit, and he released the brake. So I said, push. And we pushed this thing forward about a meter, and Dave bounced the brakes, so the aircraft jerked, and then he switched on the motor, started it, and you should have seen the smiles on these guys' faces that they'd actually push started an ep153, you know. It was all good fun, man. And then it's just one of the problems we had. I've mentioned landmines in my previous interview, and it's just one of the problems that one of the things the opposition used to do was they used to lay anti-personnel mines and booby traps around a landmine incident, because they knew that a helicopter would come. And the main one was anti-personnel mines, sort of in a radius away from the actual main mine. So you either landed on it or you walked on it to get to the mine site. And the other one was they used to put a fishing line across an LZ on either side of the road where a helicopter could land, and they'd attach this fishing line to the pull cord of the Type 67 grenade, you know, the old stick grenade. And as you were landing, you'd pull this fishing line out, and it would arm the grenade, and it would blow up. And Eddie Wilkie and Duncan Woods was his tech, and Wolfgang Hook, SAS medic, were landing at a mine site on the road to Rishinga. And Eddie, being all cautious and what have you, didn't want to land on the road, and he had a look at the side of the road where he could land, and he went into land in the bush, and he didn't see the phone lines. And he pushed this alouette into the phone lines, and too late, he tried to pull power to get out of there, but these phone lines had hooked around his nose wheel, and it went straight over, just like a spinning top. It just went straight over and into the ground. And Duncan Woods and Wolfgang were both very badly injured. Well, Duncan Woods, he never flew again because he was that badly injured. And this is nothing could stop Wolfgang, because he was a strong bugger, and he was up sort of a couple of months later. But as I said, that was one of the booby traps. And then later on, when we were going to the externals, and you'd hit a camp, These guys had actually rigged up an anti-helicopter booby trap, which was a TM46 mine, and they'd to put a electrical det in this mine. They'd make a hole about a meter deep that this mine just fitted in. They'd put about a foot of sand on top of this, and they'd put half a dozen of these Type 67 grenades head down into the hole, and then they'd pull the wires out and stake them to poles and wires on the outside, and then they'd fill the rest up with sand. And then as you were heading into the into the camp, basically, you'd see these explosions on the ground. And then about 5 seconds later, there was all these airbursts as these grenades went off, because the landmine would blow them into the air, and it would pull the cord as it went up. You know, it was one of those frightening things when there's those going off in the air. There's the SAM RPG-7s going off, and all the other guns. It's just really quite noisy up there. And then that was one of those things. And then right, what else I got here? So when I left the Air Force in 1977, I joined a radio shop at Mount Hamden. Des Reynolds was a one-man band, and he ran aircraft electronic services. And I started working for him. And he was actually based right next to a company called Rhodesia. And Rhodesia was run by Wolf Woods, an old 7th Squadron chap. And he started he got a license to overhaul R2 3B motors for the Air Force and components. And he had this shop there called SA Rhodesia, and he used to overhaul all the engines. And after a while, it expanded that he actually did servicing as well, and to help the load on aircraft servicing section at New Serum. So he used to do majors and minors out there as well, and he employed a lot of ex-Air Force guys there. And me being right next door, it saved them sending an electrician and a radio bloke out from New Serum to come and do the electrical servicing. They worked out, I'd worked on Alouette, so I was then licensed to do the electrical and radio servicing. And it was basically almost the same as being back in the Air Force, except you wore civvies, you know, doing all these servicings. And then after that, I used to work as well, all the flying clubs, the little training aircraft. They had old valve radios in them. Agricare was around the corner. They had a whole fleet, and they had old radios as well. And I used to keep these things going. And Agricare worked out it was cheaper to hire me than to having to send their aircraft all the time. So I changed trades. I went to work for Agricare. And the boss at Agricare was Mike Saunders, and Mike Saunders had been OC of 1 Squadron, and he used to fly Hunters, and he did reserve duties. He flew Lynxes, and his operation manager was Dave Thorne from 7 Squadron. He left at that time, and also on 7 Squadron, at least at Agricare, we had myself and John Britton had joined up Jake Story. He ran the Bell 47s, spraying aircraft. We had 5 Bell 47s. And Jake used to look after those. John went and worked with him as a helicopter tech. I was there as the radio electrical guy. And as I say, Mike Saunders there. At one stage, all of us were called up on, and we all wound up at the same FAF. It was amazing. And then Norman Walsh, the boss of the Air Force, he was good friends with Mike Saunders. And we actually got a request from somewhere in the government that the minefields, the cordon sanitaire, they had to be sprayed with defoliant. I think it was 78, 79, the start of the rains. They had to be sprayed with defoliant, and the contractor that they had organised couldn't make it on time. So they basically asked if Agricare could spray this cordon sanitaire for them. And Mike sort of explained that we didn't have enough aircraft. We had one Thrush Commander, which was the old iron engine, 9-cylinder radial. And so they said, all right, we'll make a plan. Yeah, so I was given instructions, and I rolled up in my Agricare truck at 7 Squadron. And I went to Jeff Dartle, and I said, Jeff, could I please have an Alouette 3, please? And he was a little bit taken aback. So he said, I can just come in here and ask for an Alouette 3. So I said, well, here's a number. Just phone this number. So he phoned this number, and he was sort of immediately informed just to give me whatever I asked for, you know. So I got hold of this Alouette 3, and I went to the armory, and I said, I'd like a set of twin Brownings, but I'd like them harmonized for a right-hand orbit, because all our normal twin Brownings are on the left-hand side, so it's left-hand orbit. So all that duly done. Jake Story, he ran the helicopters, also ex-Air Force. We went down to the Smersh hangar. Now, the Smersh hangar, in the early days of sanctions, all the tobacco that wasn't sold were put in purpose-built corrugated iron sheds in the industrial sites. They used to just fill them with tobacco and eventually get rid of them. So the Air Force got hold of one of these things, and we called it our Smersh hangar, because anything you didn't want anybody to see, you went in there and did it. The bells were, pardon me, the bells were built in there, and so I went down there with this Alouette 3, and I met Jake Story there, and we actually converted this Alouette 3 with Bell 47 spray gear, spray booms. We put a single tank in the back, a Honda-powered pump. Up. Put the Browning on the right-hand side, and we were all set to go. And then Mike Saunders flew this thrush into New Serum, and I went to see Johannes in the spray shop, and I said, where it's yellow, I want it to be green and brown. So he sprayed this thrush aircraft, and I got an armored seat out of an Alouette 3 and installed it in this thrush. And there we were all set to go, and we had our thrush in this Alouette 3 parked in the Smersh hangar. And no one basically knew about it except when they saw this jungle green and brown thrush. And then we just started to spray, and Mike Saunders managed to get 2 AGCATs, which is a biplane spraying airplane from a contract in South Africa. So we didn't do much spraying, but they took over of the actual rest of the spraying. So we handed all this gear back, and it was, you'd fly along, one tech on each gun, spraying away happily. And as I say, fortunately, we didn't have to go in the really hot areas, but it was one of those interesting ones. And that old jungle green and brown thrush, it stayed at Mount Hamlin for a long time, because it was a very old one. It was hardly ever used. It was eventually sprayed back to being yellow. And then this is one of the other things at AgriCare with Mike Saunders. He went to a spray convention in the States, and he saw the latest and greatest and what have you. And in 1978, end of 78, he sort of suggested it'd be a very good idea if I went on holiday to the UK with my family. So we wound up in London and what have you, but I had a short excursion to make, and I had to go to the town of Torbay. You've heard of Torquay, but Torbay. It was actually on the old railway station there. There was the firm there called Rackall Decker, and they were working on a thing called a trisponder system, a little blue ultra high frequency unit. They either worked as a master or a slave. And all these things basically did was they used in a set of 3 master, 2 slaves, and the master would send a signal to each of the units and work out how long the turnaround time was, and they could tell you exactly how far away each one was. So if you had the 2 base units in fixed locations, you knew their location. You could always work out where this third one was by triangulation, and if you knew which side of the baseline you're operating on. And they had incorporated this into a thing called the Del Norte Flying Flagman, which when you are spraying, basically you have a man with a flag on each end of the spraying run, and the pilot lines up these 2 flags and sprays your run, and then the next run the guys move along however it is, and then you come back and spray it. So those are your flagmen. So this is a flying flagman. And you had the unit in the aircraft which had its own master. And the original idea was you'd put these things on high ground, silos and hills and or tops of buildings. And what they were doing in Torbay was they were using this flagman to guide the hovercraft ferries and the other ferries in from on the channel crossings. When they got bad weather, you had a left-right indicator, which was a row of red and green LEDs. And it would keep you in line as long as you preset your positions exactly where you wanted to fly or where you wanted to go to. And you used exactly the same thing for the flying flagman. You you told the unit which side of the baseline you're on. You went to your first point, hit a button, and it registered that point. You hit the end of your run, hit that button, and you then had your line, and you then told it how to which way you were going to spray and how wide the spray swaths were, and it would just guide you left, right, and the light would come on. You'd spray as long as you stayed on that line. It was fine, and I went along there, and these guys showed me how this lot worked. But they also gave me an emulator, which means that you could actually you could enter coordinates into the base unit, and rather than having to fly over the point. Now, at that time, the Canberras were using the RAM system, which was a radio activated marker system, which was an A60 receiver with a magnesium flare, and the can would go up at night. The scouts, whoever, would place these. The first flare was on initiation point, which was in line, and then the second one was actually in the camp. So the can would go along, and it would ignite the first flare, line itself up, ignite the second flare, and bomb on the second flare, which was all very well, but you actually had to get in the camps to put these things up. So this emulator, you could actually pre-position everything. And I came back from holidays, and this box arrived with all this gear, and we put it in Agricare's Cessna 206, and we did trials, and we showed it to the Air Force. We had one remote on top of our hangar at Charles Prince, and one at Matoora Shangat, our relay station. And we asked the Air Force to mark up where they would like us to go to, and they marked on a map, and they said we wanted IP here and we wanted bomb there, basically. So entered all this data in, and we had Air Force reps on the ground at these places, and lo and behold, this Cessna 206 rolled up over each point every time they asked us to go somewhere. And I'd also got a high-speed antenna at from the people at Torbay, and I was asked to install this in a Canberra, and those guys had great fun because I showed the navigators how to enter the coordinates, and away they'd go, and they'd enter all this stuff, and they didn't need the RAM systems because the left-right indicator of the LEDs had been changed into an instrument that they used to use on instrument landing system. On the glide slope, you had a left-right needle and an up-down needle, and a light in it, and virtually worked the same thing. And we handed it over, and it was given back to us after 1980, and we actually used it for tsetse spraying at Agricare. But that's another one of those interesting ones. Yeah. When we at Centenary, when we first started doing the fire force and incorporating the DAC with the paras and what have you, the DAC was taking a lot of fire from the ground, as you can imagine. And so the dispatchers actually mounted an MAG in the door. So as soon as they'd pull the slings in, they would mount this MAG in the door, and they'd go around, and they'd have their little squirt, and they were saying how good they were with this MAG. And we were at Centenary, and we'd had the links hadn't come in yet, but we still had the Provost with front guns and Frantans and Snabs and what have you, and we had the South Africans there with their single Brownings, and us with the MAG and the old cannon in the 20mm. So it was decided once and all to see who could shoot the most accurately out of all these machine guns, and the KCOR was excluded. So I got a ride in the Provost, and at the end of Centenary Dam, away from the golf course, at least on the Centenary runway away from the golf course, there was a little dam there. So we had a 1 gallon empty Shell oil tin, bright yellow piece of string and a weight, and this thing was floating in the middle of the dam. And the idea was whoever sank this would be the champions. So the Prov went up first, and I had great fun, because I think it was Podlitzen was flying it, and went in the front gun attack and fired, and this dam sort of erupted and all the water, and this fired lots of rounds, and this little yellow can was still floating there. You see, so that was no score for the Provost. And then the South African single Browning went up. Same thing. There's a dam erupted, and this little yellow tin was still floating there. And then the DAC came past, and it gave it a couple of revs. And still, this little yellow can was defying all odds, you know. And the last one to shoot was one of 7 Squadron's Alouette 3s with the old MAG, and it went up and fired about 6 rounds, and this yellow can just disappeared. It just sank. You know, there was so much lead in that dam. I was surprised that the dam itself didn't sink. You know, but they were the champions, and everybody landed. And we're heading back to the pub basically, and no one noticed that Finbar Cunningham, 7 Squadron Tech, walking up the side of the runway with his FN over his shoulder.
I was going to ask you if you were the MAG gunner on that one, Peter.
No, I wasn't allowed to shoot because I was in the KCAR. So
okay.
No, it's one of the other things flying on 7 was fuel drums. You know, when the in the latter stage of the war where you had your fixed fire forces, as the guys had fuel bladders and purpose-built refueling sets, so it saved a hell of a lot. But you still had to refuel from drums, and if you work out that every hour you flew was basically one drum that you had to handle, and as you know, the actual 44-gallon drum itself is not very strong. If you drop them off the back of a truck, unless you land them on a tire or something, they will crumple and split. And for the ones that they used to throw out of the DACs and old Jack's DC-7, they had a very interesting mod done to the drums. I don't know if many people knew about it, but they actually got a piece of plywood, a round piece of plywood that actually was a press fit into the base of the drum, because you know when they roll the seam, there's like a half-inch gap there on the edge of the rim, and they actually used to put some silicon adhesive on the base of the drum, and then they would press fit this piece of plywood into the bottom of the drum, and that would allow them to be thrown out of an aircraft, and they would land, and they wouldn't split and they wouldn't crumple. And as I said, not many people knew that, but in the Second World War, in the all the fuel for the Allies in the Africa campaign, all the fuel for aircraft and vehicles was supplied in 4-gallon square paraffin tins. As you know, the ones you used to get in Rhodesia was 4 gallons of paraffin, and it's worked out that a third of all the fuel supplies to the Allies during the Second World War that was supplied in those tins was lost either through rust or breakages. And this is basically how they overcome it on the drums with our mob there. And as I say, for every hour of flying, you had to. It was virtually one drum, and I got about 1,700 hours. So that's an awful lot of drums. It made you very strong. This is one of the things when I was doing radios up at Kariba at FAF2. Every Friday we used to meet at a different mess, and with the police or the army or the Air Force, internal affairs, and we worked out that the actual roads in Kariba would make a hell of a thing for a soapbox race. And so we eventually worked out that amongst the 4 bunches there, that's the Air Force, Army, Internal Affairs, and the police, we would have our own soapbox race. And I went back to IS Radio, and we actually got components from MT of matchless motorcycle front wheels and found some bicycle wheels for the front, and we made our downhill racer. But word had leaked out that we were going to have this sort of private downhill race. And this thing just grew arms and legs because everybody wanted in on this thing. And all the armies and Salisbury and the Air Force at Thornhill, they wanted to be in it. And the original date was changed, and the Air Force organised it, and they supplied a DC-3 to fly all the carts up there. And so we had this downhill race. And Phil Russell, Amidala Russell, he was our driver in the IS-1. And the Brown jobs at Turndep in Kariba, they'd actually got a half-ton ammunition trailer. You've mentioned them before, and they actually made a soapbox cart up out of this lot. They used the jockey wheels for the front wheels, and they had the brakes and everything. And they actually just beat us because they had all the heats, and then there was only the 2 of us left, the IS-1 and this one, and they flashed past the finishing post first, but their brakes didn't work, so they just kept on going. So we actually won on disqualification. So, oh yes, when I was at Grand Reef, we were had a call out early one morning and got involved in a punch up. And normal thing, you're flying back, and as we heading back, they had more business for us. So we had to land, refuel, rearm, service, and then head off again. But as we landed at Grand Reef, right next to the helicopter position, was standing these lovely young ladies. There was Miss Rhodesia and Miss South Africa, and they were on a tour of the country, you know. And we had no time. We zoomed in there, and they said, "Can they help?" So I said, "Yeah, just empty all the doppies out of the of the hull of the K car." And there, these young ladies were getting in there and getting these 20 mil links and doppies out, and then after that, I said, "Open those boxes and start rearming." You know, while I'm refueling and servicing, and these young ladies, they're eager to help, and as soon as we were all set to go, we waved goodbye, and away they went. And all the rest of the lads at the FAF there, they had them for lunch. And it was rather interesting because the photographer they had from the Herald, they asked him for his film because you weren't allowed to take pictures of the K car. So these young ladies are most upset with all the work that had been done, wasn't allowed to be photographed, you know. Oh yes, I was operating out of a Croy, out of on Miami farm. It was a Jim Barker's farm, and so we had 4 G cars and a K car there, and we had a Trojan on the runway, and our pilots for the G cars came to us one day and said, we've got a very special lift for you guys, because we were staying in Jim Barker's his tobacco barns, and which were right next to the runway basically, because he had his own aircraft. And we were called out, and they said we have to land at these other barns. His initial set of barns was about 500 meters away, so we went and landed there. And our pilots had said that we are going to pick up scouts, Sulu scouts, and we had to take our belts out of the MAGs and our magazines out of our FNs, because these guys were the genuine thing. You know, it was the first time they were being mass deployed, and there were 16 of them. So we landed next to these barns, and these Sulu scouts had all came out. Now I'd been trooping them a long time before, so knew what to expect. So got these guys on board, and there'd been an incursion in the Karoi area, and they were sending these guys out to actually suss out what was going on. So there we away from everybody else, got our scouts, and we flying, and looked down, and we flew over a bunch of the opposition. And there was a hell of a fight broke out, because they were shooting at these guys on the ground, calling for the Provost and Trog and the K car to come and help us, because we couldn't put these guys down, you know, because they were all dressed same, and it would have meant a hell of a mess on the ground, you know. So as soon as the K car arrived there, we had to go back, and all the RLI troopers were waiting on the runway, and we had to land back at these barns and offload the scouts again, put them back in the barns. In the meantime, all these RLI troopies were running towards the helicopters because they thought they'd got the assembly point wrong. So there's all these scouts trying to hide in the tobacco barn, and all the RLI troopies running towards us. It was very interesting. And yeah, I don't know if many people know about the hot extraction stuff that we used to do with the scouts and the SAS. I don't know if you know how it works, but what you basically have is the aircraft that's doing the hot extraction has got a cargo swing fitted, which is actually underneath the center of gravity, and it's pinned outside the aircraft, hangs underneath the aircraft. The older aircraft that's permanently in there, the 316 aircraft, but onto the actual center lift of the hook, you had a 30-meter 4-inch webbing strop that had been folded over and sewn. So rather than a rope, you had this webbing strop, and on the end of it, you had a 5-foot pole, an aluminium pole, with it had a U-bolt right through the middle that the webbing strap was actually hooked onto. And then there were 4 attachment points with a short webbing strop and a carabiner hook on each one. And on the one end, there was a piece of string tied, so you could actually tie the webbing string onto the end of the pole, so it would always stay vertical when you dropped it down. Now, the guys that had to be extracted, they permanently wore a harness in the when you were hoisting. You had your recovery harness that the guy would put under his shoulders, and you'd hang on to it, and you'd hook it up, and away you'd go. But these guys had a 3-inch webbing strap that was actually sewn together, and that they were individually made for each guy, so they fitted around your chest here. And there was a D-ring on the inside that was held flat with a piece of Velcro, and it had 2 little straps, almost like a bra, that would hold it up there all the time. And these guys wore that all the time. And if they had to be hot extracted, and there were trees in the area, you would actually lower this pole down, and the piece of string kept it straight, so you could lower it down. The guys just hooked on, and you just pulled out and went. And the most you could take was 4, and most of the time you're dragging them through trees, and they weren't very happy at the fact they're getting dragged through trees, but they're very happy that you're lifting them out of there. But at the same time, you were a stationary sitting duck, because you had a hover, and you're above the trees, and everybody's shooting at you, and there's a KCAR trying to suppress rounds, a link trying to suppress rounds, and then you're lifting these guys out. But each of the guys in the bush had this strap on them permanently, so you didn't have to send down straps and everything. It just saved time. Now it's one of the because Gary Whittle and myself, we did the first trials all the way back in 74, 75, and dragging each other up and down the 1-4 runway at New Serum, and seeing how this stuff whipped and whatever.
Would you then land at like a safe place, and then?
Oh yeah, you'd get up and drag them in air, and you'd away from the action, where you could actually land, recover all this gear, and put it on board, and then put whoever's on board and head back. But it was an odd sight. You'd see this long 30-meter piece of webbing strap and guys dangling from the bottom of it. No, I think we're about done, man. And thanks very much. And
excellent, Peter. Well,
we'll
thank you so much. I found that really interesting. Thank you very, very much once again. Much appreciated.
Okay, John. Cheers then. Bye. Thanks.